Dr. Gordon, I think, has just asked me to go ahead. Am I right, Jake? Okay. All right. So let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Hunt Davis. I'm a professor emeritus of history at the University of Florida. I'm also. Okay. I'm also a member of the Alachua County African and African American Historical Society on the board, and I served in many years back as the director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Florida. I would like to just mention one thing. One of the things in teaching I wanted to do was try as much to relate African history to our students here. And Jane Lander's work and other people working on Fort Mose, and the people who were, many of the enslaved people who escaped and found freedom there were already Catholic because they were from Congo, which had a long Catholic tradition. And then wars there led to some of them being sold into slavery and ending up. So it was a way to make that connection very directly to Florida students that, hey, Congo, well, I mean, look, St. Augustine, right over there. So thank you. We have 4 speakers this morning. I better put my glasses on so I can read. On this panel, from exploration and enslavement to freedom. The first is Dr. Rick Stevenson, who has a PhD in history from Michigan State and is an assistant instructional professor in African American studies at UF, and also is teaching theological and biblical research methods at the United Theological Seminary in Ocala. He also, in addition to having a PhD in history, holds a doctorate in divinity from the Southern California School of Ministry. His primary area of research focuses on the role of suicide by drowning as a form of resistance during the transatlantic slave trade. He is a certified scuba diver and has done multiple underwater expeditions in search of sunken slave ships. The second speaker is Dr. Connie Lester, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida and is also the editor of the Florida Historical Society, which is the peer-reviewed publication, scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. She is the director of the Regional Initiative for Collecting the History, Experiences, and Stories of Central Florida. She's a historian of 19th century history whose research focuses on the American South, economics, and agriculture. She is the author of Up from the Mud Sills of Hell, The Farmers' Alliance, Populism, and Progressive Agriculture in Tennessee, 1870 to 1915. The third speaker is Dr. Alyssa Cole, who has a PhD in history from the University of Kansas and is currently an assistant professor of African American studies and of history at the University of Florida. Her specialization is in the intersections of history, health, and black communities in the American Midwest. Her research focuses on health activism and exploring the historical context and contemporary implications of black individuals and communities. She has a book manuscript at the Johns Hopkins University Press entitled Empowered Voices, Frederica Douglass Sprague Perry and the Fight for Health Equity in Early 20th Century Kansas City, and also a forthcoming article on the Unveiling Shadows, Afro-Skepticism, and the Unpacking of War in the Black Paranoid Tradition. Our fourth speaker is Karen Kirkman, who's a historian and president of the historical Haile Homestead at Canapa Plantation in Gainesville. The city of Gainesville awarded Ms. Kirkman with the 2022 Preservation Champion Award. The award recognizes an individual who has made significant contributions to local historic preservation efforts. She champions the cause of preserving black cemeteries in Alachua County and beyond, a longtime member of the Alachua County Historical Commission, she served as past chair of the commission, and with Kevin McCarthy as co-author, wrote and published the Historic Haile Homestead at Kanapaha Plantation Illustrated History. So I will leave it to Dr. Stevenson to be the first speaker, and I would ask each speaker to confine to 20 minutes out of courtesy to the remaining people on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. As was mentioned, I'm a diver, and so I'm more comfortable underwater than I am in front of people. Frederick Douglass said, "An educated person is unfit to be a slave." Restricting access to literacy education for certain groups has a long-standing place in United States history, especially as a tool of purposely disrupting and damaging the African American community and denying them of civil rights. As an overview of the state of the enslaved Africans' education in America, focusing primarily on Florida and Alachua County, I pondered the significance of the state of education in Florida as a microcosm of the state of academic affairs nationwide. In her book titled Self-Taught, African American Education in Slavery and Freedom, Dr. Heather Williams proposes a similar inquiry. What did ordinary African Americans in the South do to provide education for themselves during slavery and when slavery ended? The title of Williams's book and the proposition's question is very dynamic. It lets the reader know from the outset that if education were to be accomplished among African Americans, it would be done by the will and the ingenuity of black people themselves, oftentimes with the help of others, but for the most part, in the surreptitious perspective of the plantocracy. Therefore, as we examine this subject at hand, I will use two lenses of exploration to explain the questions surrounding the education of African peoples in Alachua County, as well as Florida and the South in general. One lens will be from the perspective of the dominant culture, and the other will be by way of the African persons themselves. As such, the terms African American, Negro, and colored will be used somewhat interchangeably as a designation of persons of African descent living in America, and these reasons will be explained later on. For instance, when the census began in 1790, the racial categories for household population were, quote, free white, free persons by color, and slaves. Census takers did not use standard forms of early census. 60 years later, the codes for enumerating changed. These new codes added letters to designate one's race, which was W for white, B for black, and M for mulatto. The data states further that as time went on, the census data collection, the methods of reporting of racial identity changed, and the options was designated by the individual themselves. This paper looks at anti-literacy laws that were employed by the South, especially in Florida between 1740 and 1867. The laws that prohibited the enslaved and sometimes free Americans from reading and writing were politically as well as academically motivated. Again, Frederick Douglass reminds us that the black man needs three boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. As a reminder, that's pretty good, huh? As a reminder, the thesis of this paper is to look at educational systems as a way of looking at the critical analysis that underpins racism when it comes to education. For instance, while examining a speech given by Thomas Jefferson in 1788, we encounter the nexus of white supremacist thought. His argument is that black people of African descent, are not made of the same genus as white people, and therefore the assumption is that because they're different, they're also inferior. Jefferson is suggesting that people of African descent are not created in the image of God and therefore are not deserving of a quality education as the Anglo-Saxon. The purpose of the examination, however, is this. An African American education in the context of Alachua County and Florida in general demonstrates the world of white supremacy. It demonstrates the role of white supremacy. How does education function politically? In the mid-19th century, a newspaper article written by John Sullivan argued for this term, the manifest destiny. The argument is that manifest destiny is the Europeans' way of overtaking the newfound land we now call America. In the article published by the Harvard Gazette, Dr. Donald Iacovone says this: white supremacy precedes the origins of the United States. Every aspect of social interaction between 18th century and 19th century is dominated by white identity. He goes on to state that anyone that is not of Anglo-Saxon heritage is not an American. And so therefore, when it comes to education, they don't have the same access, nor do they have the same need. So the question becomes, how did education of the enslaved in African-American communities in America and Florida occur? According to Dr. Catherine Russell Brown, she says, in relationship to another document called Fugitive Pedagogy, she argues that white America went to greater lengths to minimize and affect the outlaw of teaching African-American history. State boards of education mandated pre-approved K-12 curriculum for classroom instruction. In other words, they decided what could be taught and what could not be taught. In 1860, the state population, Florida state, population was 140,000. By 1870, it had grown to 187,000. In 1870, the census listed 96,000 whites, 91,000 blacks, or Negroes. 8 of the 39 counties that were settled had a majority of freed men. So it makes sense then why there was such a fear of educating Negro population. The Negro population in Mississippi voted the first black senator in 1870, 5 years after the war. The second black senator was voted the same year. So education and politics have always been connected. After 3 days of balloting and voting in 1870, the Mississippi legislator seated Hiram Rhodes Rebel as the first African American in Congress. American teachers have always been subject to community pressures and prejudices. From the colonial times to today, teachers who want to teach underprivileged communities are exasperated. The Union Academy was one of the most important institutions in Gainesville's black community. For 50 years it was. It was the town's first public high school, and from its graduates came some of the most important leading teachers and leaders in the black community. The facility was built by black carpenters during Reconstruction who learned their skills during slavery. But what is interesting about that, according to Charles Hildreth, is that as the war ends, the commerce changes, and so does the railroad. When the railroad changes, it begins to bring more black people into the community, and therefore making more opportunity to educate these people. By 1870, there are 765 black people in Gainesville. A few years later, the population is 1,444. As I've argued earlier, politics and education are a couplet that cannot be separated. We would be remiss if we don't see them as working together against a given population. I think it's important at this juncture to illuminate the fact that black people after the Civil War were equipped, though at small doses, with the will and the ability and the desire to solve their own social problems. But education was foundational to that accomplishment. It is necessary to understand that the threat of education, or the threat of educating former enslaved populations, pose a threat to understanding the roles of the state, the church, the family, the matters of education, and the interests of white supremacy. The South's landed upper class tolerated the idea of educating the charity to poor whites, but they enforced laws against educating blacks. Because what they realize is, if black people learn to read, if they learn to communicate with those kinds of numbers, they could control the electorate. We saw that in Mississippi. And so therefore, as Alachua County begins to develop, schools begin to grow, we find that these individuals who are in the, quote, plantocracy, unquote, are taking control of how we are educated. Before the construction of the Gainesville Academy, there was first the East Florida Seminary, which was founded in 1853 by a Methodist church. The legislature, how much time I have? The legislature of the state of Florida, in an act known as the Seminary Act in 1851, provided two institutions of higher learning in Florida, the east and the west of the Suwannee River. The East Florida Independent Institution was in Ocala, and it was called the East Florida Seminary, founded in 1853. The other was the Gainesville Academy, which was also founded in 1861. Now, what happened was the seminary was closed once the war started. But then once the war was opened, the seminary was reopened. And it was reopened as it connected with three other schools. The East Florida Seminary, along with three other schools, the Florida Agricultural College, established in 1884, the St. Petersburg Normal Institution, and the St. Petersburg and the Florida Military Educational College all came together to become what we now know as the University of Florida. This merger was a result of the Buckman Act in 1905. The initial name of the school was the University of State of Florida. It was initially named specifically for white males, because under the role of white supremacy, white males controlled the power, the insight, and the education. And so it's important to understand that every time we think about education and politics, we have to look at this white male heteronormity as a role and as an influence on how we do what we do. There's a document written by a guy named Frederick Rosen, and he says this: Alachua County in 1865 had no state or support public school system. Prior to the war, the Gainesville Academy, a small private school, was located at Northeast 1st Street. It served the educational needs of the white people, of the white community. Slaves were forbidden to learn to read, and poor whites who could not afford tuition seldom took advantage of this opportunity. Now, this is really important. I want to offer some background for why this statement about the poor whites and poor blacks is important. Education is designed to transform people to function within a community and to make it better. The problem with a white hegemonic society is this: there has to be a way to separate black people, white people, brown people, immigrants, so that white supremacy can maintain its status. And that's why critical race theory is so important. Because what we learn from this part right here, where the poor whites could get education, is this: if poor whites and poor blacks go to school together, then they see each other as equal. But the moment you decide that you want to control that black population, you have to make a division. That's why critical race theory is so important, because one of the tenets of critical race theory is interest convergence. Interest convergence is when poor whites, middle-class whites, and rich whites converge together to make sure black and browns and immigrants don't work together, even at the detriment of the poor whites, because they buy into their whiteness as opposed to buying into the fact that we do have more in common than the things that we don't. And so we see this as early as the early 1800s, that even though education was available for these poor whites and not available for these blacks, one of the ways that when blacks did begin to get education, you see people putting these blocks up that say white people and black people ought not work together. And even today, we have to deal with the same issues. Whenever you think about education, you have to take into account the role of power. I'm not talking about financial power. I'm talking about the ability to critique your society and to critique your behavior and critique those around you. Thompson, in his argument, says this: Educational practices that both minimize the role of black people in the formation and building of the United States and deny black literacy are legacies of the slave trade. The slave trades are the starting point for analyzing how laws limited opportunities for black literacy. Often these laws were tied to religion and other special forces under slave codes, state laws, and prescribed punishment. Watch this. For anyone engaged in activity that promoted literacy for enslaved blacks, punishment targeted enslaved black people for blacks as well as whites. In other words, rich white people don't like white people either. They're not in the same class. When poor whites think that the president-elect is in their corner, he ain't thinking about them. And that's not new. That concept of white trash did not start in the black community. It began by separating poor whites from poor blacks, from indigenous people. It's a concept of superiority that filters its way down through the way we are educated. Now, Frederick Rosen says this, and I'll close. The many black youngsters who lived in Gainesville with their families constitute a new potential population for education. Due to the increased population of Negro children, the Assistant Commissioner John Sprague urged the local schools and societies to buy land and to build buildings to prepare for the education of the blacks. But he also says this: be careful that you also provide opportunity for protection for incoming teachers. That teachers who came down from the South suffered the same plight as people in the black community, because education and educating these black people will make them think that they are at the same level. One of the things that we have to do today is go backwards. In the black community, we educate ourselves. There are 112 HBCUs. 79 were started by black churches. We taught our kids in the basements of our homes. We taught our kids in our churches. And Malcolm reminds us, Malcolm X, we cannot rely on the oppressor to educate our kids. That's not a new concept. That concept is found even here in Alachua County. Money that was available to educate these young kids was pushed aside because it had to maintain a certain hegemony. Malcolm reminded us that the oppressor benefits from the undereducation of our kids. We cannot rely on the oppressor to give us academic power. For the parents, we've got to get off the phones and spend more time with our kids. For the kids, you got to put down the phone, pick up a book. Use your computer to enter the libraries and archives and special collections. Begin to challenge your mind not to simply recite information, but to learn it. We're under the impression that when we think about slavery, we think about chains on our ankles and chains on our arms. I want to argue that slavery had put chains on our minds. That we're no longer free thinkers. We're no longer critical thinkers. We no longer analyze data like we used to. But it's not new. Alachua County and the educational system of black kids was designed to make sure they didn't succeed. And what did they do? They went underground. They figured it out. And my argument today is the way education is being promoted today is designed to make us paupers. It's designed to keep us uncritical. And the only way that history can repeat itself is if you didn't know what happened before. Last statement. On January 6, 2020, there was an insurrection in Washington, D.C. And the news purported that that's the first time this ever happened in America. That's not true. Because in 1898, white supremacy overthrew the government in Wilmington, North Carolina. And if you look at what happened on January 6, 2020, and you look at 1898, they are almost identical. And that's one of the reasons why education is so important. Because if you are properly educated and you're given the tools to do research, you know how to go back and find out what's really true and what is not. Because sometimes history's just ugly. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's nice to be with you. It's a hard act to follow. As I've worked on this paper, it has changed titles a couple of times, so I will tell you what the current title is: Jim Crow and Modern Agriculture, Land, Markets, and Scientific Agriculture in Alachua County. The promise of 40 acres and a mule that circulated during and after the Civil War was a phrase that implied a life of self-sufficiency that characterized what had previously been the American ideal of the yeoman farmer. Yeoman farmers were men who exercised political independence because they were economically dependent on no one. They constructed their cabins from timber harvested from their own forests, fed their families from the crops they grew and the animals they raised, and marketed the surplus to pay their taxes and purchase a few consumer goods. 40 acres and the mule met their physical needs and assured their acceptance as political citizens in the world that existed before 1860. And I can imagine that many previously enslaved people thought that that was what would happen with them when they owned land and could farm for themselves. But post-Reconstruction agriculture undermined yeomanry for farmers of all races. The new American economy and the political support for that economy transformed work and citizenship as the United States entered the era of industrial capitalism that lasted from about 1880 to 1970. To support the rapid urbanization that accompanied the new industrialization, farmers were drawn willingly or reluctantly into commercial agriculture that required capital investment in land, manufactured equipment, purebred livestock, and hybrid seeds. Markets shifted from local to national and international buyers who required standardization in size, color, and grade for everything from fruit to corn to cotton. The number of acres under cultivation rose, but the number of farms decreased as individual farmers were unable to bear the cost of commercial agriculture and sold their land to better capitalized farmers. Those farmers who remained, quote, self-sufficient also remained poor. The burden of Jim Crow segregation and political disfranchisement meant that black farmers practiced self-sufficiency and organized marketing cooperatives to maximize their selling power, but they were not recognized as political citizens because of their work and their land holding. In the post-World War II era, the number of farmers and farms suffered a dramatic loss as technology and globalization reorganized agriculture in ways that former Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz described as get big or get out. Black farmers adopted a number of strategies to remain on the land, including entering organic farm production and embracing the farm-to-table movement. To understand the history of African American agriculture with special interest for Alachua County, we will divide the 150-year history since 1875 into 3 topics for discussion. First, the strategies for acquiring and holding on to the land. Second, cooperative and educational strategies. And third, post-civil rights agricultural strategies. After 1861, as the Union armies moved into the South, enslaved men and women self-emancipated. In their flight to get behind the military lines, they presented a logistical problem for the armies: how to feed and house the refugees from slavery and still maintain fighting capability. The Second Confiscation Act of 1862 provided one solution: settle them on land confiscated from rebelling planters and let them feed themselves by farming the land and raising hogs and chickens. President Andrew Johnson dashed the hopes for permanent land for freedmen when he offered pardons to planters who had taken up arms against the United States. His actions led to radical Reconstruction, a decade of congressional action that included the Southern Homestead Act, which President Johnson signed into law on June 21, 1866. The law provided for the disposal of millions of acres of public land in Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi for settlement of freedmen and loyal refugees. The Freedmen's Bureau was tasked with assisting freedmen in obtaining the land. With more public land than any state east of the Mississippi River, Florida seemed a national choice for settlement, and a number of freedmen from Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina made their way south to start a new life. As tempting as Florida might be, there were also significant barriers to be overcome. White landowners opposed settlement by freedmen, sometimes violently. Paperwork could only be filed in Tallahassee, a not easily accessible location. Land for settlement had not been surveyed, a cost many could not afford. And clearing and draining the land for crops were laborious activities that deterred many. And yet, at the end of October 1866, freedmen had entered 32,000 acres in Florida. Most of the freedmen's holdings were small, and observers predicted they would ultimately fail, but Freedmen's Bureau agents recorded a number of successes, several in Alachua County. Bureau records cite James McCartan of Noonanville for his 80 acres, 40 fenced and under cultivation in 1868. He had a comfortable home, stables, a cow barn, and a well. That year, he harvested corn and potatoes and at least 2 bales of Sea Island cotton, which he likely sold for a profit. Charles Williams, his son Samuel, and daughter Nancy had adjoining homesteads near Archer. In 1868, they reportedly harvested 500 bushels of corn and 3 bales of Sea Island cotton. William Drayton, another Noonanville farmer, had 80 acres. He planted 20 acres and rented out other land. Cyrus Jackson of Morrison Mills, now Hawthorne, and Robert Marshall of Noonanville were also successful farmers named in the Bureau's report. When the Bureau discontinued operations on January 1, 1869, approximately 4,000 freedmen had entered homesteads in Florida. 5 years later, only 577 final homestead certificates were issued to both black and white farmers. One historian attributes the high failure rate to the actual conditions of the land available to settlers. Virtually impenetrable palmetto swamp, which required 20th century construction equipment to clear and drain. He goes on to assert that much of the land available under the Southern Homestead Act remained unsettled even after the collapse of the Florida land boom of the mid-1920s. With the demise of the Freedmen's Bureau, acquiring land became an individual effort. A couple of examples of strategies to acquiring land will demonstrate both the difficulties African Americans faced and the precariousness of their land holding. Some black farmers squatted on land and made modest improvements, clearing and cultivating fields, fencing pastures, and building houses. In time, everyone assumed their ownership of the land until someone else filed a claim on the improved land and the squatters could not produce a deed. In another example, the Jackson Hamilton family of West Orange County owned several small pieces of property that they had acquired as payment for clearing land for white settlers. Think back to what I just told you about the problems of clearing that land. In the wake of the Ocoee Massacre in 1920 and the demand that all black residents in Ocoee sell their property, the Hamiltons were forced to sell theirs, but were able to move to land they owned in Seminole County. A farmer and eventual store owner in Sumter County worked for several years in the phosphate mines of Polk County to acquire funds to purchase a small piece of land near Oklahoma. Raising vegetables on a garden plot behind his house and selling them at a roadside stand on the edge of his property, he eventually was able to construct and open a small store and purchase additional land. However, black farmers acquired land, as the Hamiltons' experience demonstrates, it was always at risk through violence or intimidation. In Alachua County, A.S.J. Allen, a minister at Pleasant Plain Methodist Church in Jonesville, and a prominent black farmer, was murdered in a confrontation with his white neighbor over property boundary lines. Despite the obstacles, the number of black farmers of all types, sharecropping to land owning, continued to rise. In 1900, there were 746,717 black farmers in the United States. By 1920, that number had risen to its historical high at 925,708 farmers, almost a quarter of whom were part or full owners of the farms they worked. Black landowning farmers and tenant farmers, like their white counterparts, operated in an agricultural climate marked by the rise of industrial capitalism and urbanization. Agricultural markets became national and competitive, imposing regimens of standardization and pushing small farmers into commercial production and away from safety-first agriculture. Failure in these unregulated markets meant loss of land, and often a move into tenancy or low-wage industrial labor for whites and day labor for African Americans. Both blacks and whites were being pushed down into tenancy and sharecropping. Both black and white farmers fought back through agricultural organizations like the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance originated in Texas in 1877 and spread across the South until it was the dominant farm organization by the 1880s. The Alliance was politically active but nonpartisan, and by 1890 it had made enough electoral gains to worry the Democratic and Republican parties. The Alliance formed cooperatives, both local and statewide, that sold at a discount to members farm equipment, fertilizer, those sorts of things, and collectively marketed agricultural products, believing if they sold it in bulk, they could get a higher price than individual farmers could get. A Colored Farmers Alliance met separately, but was affiliated with the Farmers Alliance. And I want to make this clear. They worked together in the sense that they had common cause. They were facing the same economic issues. They did not work together as whites were expecting to be, the blacks were equal with them. In fact, they met in very separate groups, but they made common cause. African Americans could shop at the Alliance stores and market their crops through the Alliance cooperatives. And they expressed their views in the Alliance newspapers. And I will say that black farmers were far more upfront about what the problems were and what the solutions were many times than white farmers were. In 1887, the Florida Farmers Alliance held its annual meeting in Gainesville with 1,700 farmers in attendance. I have no understanding of how many of those may have been black farmers. In December 1890, the National Farmers Alliance, the Colored Farmers Alliance, and the Farmers Mutual Benefit Association met in conference at the Marion Opera House in Ocala, Florida, where they adopted the Ocala Demands, a document that called for a more open political process, an economy that operated for the benefit of all economic actors, and a more regulatory national government to create a fair playing field for all. The Ocala Demands became the foundations for the principles adopted by the People's Party, the Populist Party, that emerged in 1891 and ran its first candidate for president of the United States in 1892. Black farmers played an active role in the political activities of the Populist Party. Although the party did not survive the end of the 19th century, its articulation of a comprehensive outline for a modern government and economy informed agrarian reforms of the Progressive Era and the New Deal. The demise of the Farmers' Alliance and the Populist Party did not destroy the cooperative efforts. In 1922, the Negro Farmers Union, a cooperative marketing association, was organized in 6 Florida counties, and H.H. Williams of Hastings as its first president. Cooperatives continue to be a part of Black agricultural practices, as evidenced by the 1995 founding of the National Black Farmers Association. The focus on farms and marketing was accomplished by state and federal programs for agricultural education. Initially, agrarian outreach programs were part of the larger agenda of the farm organizations themselves, like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance. They centered on the presentation of agricultural information at local alliance meetings, the publication of farm newspapers like the Florida Agriculturalist, and multi-day farm institutes to demonstrate new farming techniques. Land-grant universities also played a central role in the development and dispersal of scientific agricultural information. The land-grant system of colleges and universities was created through legislation enacted by the U.S. Congress in 1863. The Morrill Act called for the creation of 1 or more public universities in every state, funded from the public lands that were made available for that purpose. Land-grant universities were tasked with providing education in agriculture, the mechanical arts, that is engineering, and military science. In 1890, a second land-grant act established African American colleges to fill the same role in the Black community. FAMU was that university. The Hatch Act of 1887 created agricultural experiment stations to conduct soil, fertilizer, pesticide, and seed research and address common problems in agricultural production, increase yields, and create new plant varieties. I'll skip down, since I only have 2 minutes left, and talk to you about, in 1914, there was another act that was very important to both Black and white farmers, and that was the creation of the Smith-Lever Act to create the Cooperative Farm Extension Service and establish a partnership between land-grant universities and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to disseminate the information produced by the experiment stations. Although the legislation provided for a Negro Extension Service, placement of Black farm and home extension agents required the consent of the county in which they would work. Not every county allowed access to such agents. In Florida, you didn't have Black agents south of Marion County, except in Hillsborough County, even though you had populations of Black farmers there. Alachua County received its first Black agent in 1917. And under the provision, they worked under initially the Negro state agent, A.A. Turner, who based his program on Booker T. Washington's philosophy of self-help. The participants in the farm extension program were associated with the 6,320 landowning Black farmers in Florida, because tenant farmers had to have permission from the owner of the land in order to participate in the programs. The programs focused on soil conservation, crop rotation, cultivation, harvesting, selective breeding, crop diversification, disease control, and insect control. Home agents taught sewing, canning, home improvement, which included adding screens to windows and sanitary privies, and improving gardening techniques, health, and marketing of home products. In 1936, Alachua County received its first home agent, Beulah Schutte, and she was followed by Ploy Britt in 1945. I'll say one more thing, and we can talk about it in the question period, and that was the way in which the Extension Service also was responsible for 4-H, for teaching children to be good stewards of the land and teaching them agricultural knowledge. That was important for so many children, black children, who did the same projects as white children, who went to the camps, who went to state and national conventions, and who earned scholarships to go to land-grant universities and extend their education. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It looks like I'm going to be competing with this parade, so I'm going to try to speak loudly. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to provide a brief introduction, talk about some national health trends, and then local health trends related to Alachua County, and then a brief conclusion. So just a little bit about myself. I actually started my academic career wanting to be a military historian, and so a lot of the work that I've done has been on military history throughout the 20th century. When I conducted work on World War I discovered wrongly as a graduate student that I thought that the work that I had wanted to do had already been done, and so I needed to pivot. And so I started looking at how the United States began to take care of returning veterans, and that's how I got into the history of medicine. And so my current research is on the Black hospital movement in Kansas City during the early 20th century. And in conducting this research for this paper, I found some links between Alachua County and Kansas City, Kansas, and so that's exciting, and I'll speak about that in a little bit. So during the 19th century, hospitals as we recognize them today did not exist. Hospitals served mainly to care for indigent populations or as almshouses. They were not institutions that anyone who thought themselves to be respectable would visit. They were often places where the poor went to die. To obtain medical care, those who could afford it would call physicians or midwives to treat them in their homes. Physicians did not understand the concept of germ theory until the latter half of the 19th century, and even then it wasn't accepted, and practices didn't change until the early 20th century. This meant that washing hands before or between several surgeries was not common practice. Medicine at this time was not professionalized, meaning that while there were schools, their standards varied widely and medical practice varied from physician to physician. Life expectancy was extremely low for all races, though Black Americans' life expectancy was 21 years. Clear reasons for that include, for those in the South in particular, hard labor, no access to basic medical treatment, inadequate food and rest, and extreme psychological and physical violence. This was also the period where racial myths became popular in society and in the medical profession, including the myth that the skulls of African Americans were smaller than those of white people. Myths that have repeatedly been proven false, yet continue to cause immense societal damage. Mental health was non-existent, and at this time, also Dr. James Marion Sims began medical experimentation on enslaved women, who he also used as surgical experts. And finally, grave robbing became common, especially the robbing of enslaved people's graves for medical schools. This led to additional mistrust of the medical profession. The development of germ theory in the latter half of the 19th century and the adoption of practices including hand washing and aesthetic use and pain management all contributed to higher life expectancy at the beginning of the 20th century. Early health care for African Americans in the South during the 19th century resembled what some might refer to now as homeopathic remedies. Enslaved African Americans rarely received formal medical care in the case of extreme illness. More frequently, enslaved blacks received care from healers from within their own communities, often a senior woman with extensive knowledge of plants and foods that they used to cure injury and illness. Frequently, enslaved people intertwined their beliefs in the healing properties of medicinal plants with superstition, belief in ghosts, and what they refer to as hoodooism. WPA narratives from enslaved people who lived in Florida refer to several of these topics. While WPA narratives from Alachua County, Florida specifically do not exist to my knowledge anyway, narratives from surrounding cities can help illustrate what healthcare might have looked like for enslaved people in Alachua County. I spent an enormous amount of time trying to locate primary sources for Alachua County, and so this is the way that I was able to kind of construct this narrative by looking at WPA narratives, not only from Florida, but from South Carolina, where many of the enslaved people in Alachua County came from. When Alachua County was established, indigenous communities, including the Seminoles, lived in the areas surrounding what is now known as Gainesville. The Haile family, enslavers from South Carolina, moved to Alachua County in 1854, bringing with them 54 enslaved African Americans to perform forced labor on Kanapahah Plantation. Medical traditions from enslaved people in North Florida as well as South Carolina can provide a glimpse into the health practices those enslaved in Alachua County may have participated in. One formerly enslaved man from Jacksonville, Florida, named Willis Williams, stated that most enslaved people believed in superstitions at the time, including belief in evil spirits. Williams said some wore bags of salt and charcoal, believing that evil spirits would be kept away from them. Simultaneously, Williams referred to herbal and root remedies for illness, as well as enslaved grannies that served as community healers. Not only did these grannies use herbal remedies to heal their communities, but they also served as midwives. Another man, Duncan Gaines of Madison, Florida, mentioned hoodooism directly, stating there was much talk of hoodooism, and anyone ill for a long time without getting relief from herb medicines was thought to be fixed or suffering from some sin that his father had committed. Gaines' statements emphasize the importance and reliance upon herbal remedies in enslaved communities. Not only did they have the ability to cure illnesses, including fevers, colds, and stomach aches, but they also could cure afflictions of a metaphysical nature. Like Gaines and Williams, George Priddy of Palatka, Florida, remembered specific details related to childbirth, midwives' work, and the nature of superstition in Black communities. In one of the most detailed interviews regarding midwives, Priddy spoke about the process of childbirth, stating that whenever his mother was expecting and soon to give birth, his father would tell him and his siblings that his mother was about to take a trip out of state. In reality, she relocated to the attic, where she spent 6 weeks preparing for her baby's arrival. A midwife helped care for the children while his mother was away, contributing to our understanding of midwife duties during this period. Not only did they help expectant mothers prepare for imminent birth, but they also provided for families, including cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Midwives were of enormous importance to Black communities, providing a host of services, serving as nurses, cooks, cooking, cleaning, providing childcare, and maintaining a clear understanding of the healing properties of plants, foods, and herbs. Other interviewees mentioned specific remedies, indicating a familiarity with remedies the grannies would use for common ailments. Rebecca Hooks of Lake City stated that grannies were sought out more frequently than plantation doctors hired by enslavers. Some of the remedies Hooks mentioned include horehound tea and pine top tea for colds, pomegranate seeds and mint for fever, and for those unfortunate to fall ill with whooping cough, a tea made of sheep manure. Squires Jackson of Jacksonville also mentioned specific remedies from his childhood, including castor oil and calomel. Jackson said the herb doctors went from home to home during times of illness. Until many years after the Civil War, there were no practicing Negro physicians. Jackson's recollection is significant because while he provides specific remedies for common ailments, he also refers to the status of health for Black Americans during the time. African Americans in North Central Florida had few viable options for modern health care during the 19th century and continued to rely upon remedies used during enslavement for their healthcare needs. Towards the mid-19th century, white physicians began to use enslaved healers for their expertise, often simultaneously experimenting on them to perfect their practice. Using black women to perfect these practices, white male physicians in the United States worked to professionalize medicine, resulting in the delegitimization of the work black healers provided for their communities. It is during this time that courts began to charge black midwives with crimes if patients died under their care, stating that they needed to pay for a certification to legitimize their work. Without the certification, they were practicing medicine illegally and could be charged with crimes. Despite this risk and the absence of options for modern medical care, health care, black Americans continued to use traditional healing methods in their communities. Though Congress enacted legislation to establish the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, the enormous task of providing health care for millions of newly freed African Americans left many communities underserved. Black Americans continued to rely on community healers, midwives, and traditional remedies throughout the 19th century. As medicine developed into the 20th century, black Americans and practitioners of medicine assimilated. African Americans attended medical schools for blacks as medical education remained segregated. In 1900, around 23 medical schools for African Americans existed, and due to national efforts to professionalize medicine, by 1923, 2 schools remained, Howard and Meharry. Even before the closure of many black medical schools, which was prompted by the Flexner Report, Howard and Meharry were 2 of the top schools for black students who wanted to study medicine. And this rings true for the black physicians that I'm gonna speak about in a few minutes, who were popular in Gainesville, Florida, in Alachua County. The lack of access to medical schools combined with the refusal of public hospitals to allow black physicians to practice or obtain internships limited the number of black physicians graduating during this period. The few who were successful often graduated from one of the top 2 schools I mentioned earlier and interned at a hospital in one of the major cities. They moved once they completed their internships, and this is the most likely path, I argue, that Gainesville's first known black physician took. Dr. Robert B. Ayer Sr. lived in Gainesville as early as 1900 with his wife and family. Dr. Ayer owned a pharmacy and private practice at the time, alluding to the fact that he had already successfully completed his internship, which is now referred to as a residency. And this is the fun fact that I mentioned earlier about Dr. Ayers, that 2 of his sons were physicians, and Vernon Ayer was a physician as well, and he completed his residency at General Hospital No. 2 in Kansas City, which is one of the hospitals that I research. I write about how black doctors in Kansas City helped train other black physicians nationwide, so it was exciting to see that my analysis of this is held true. I had never heard of Dr. Vernon Ayer until I began my research on Alachua County. At the time that Dr. Robert Ayer Sr. lived in Gainesville, black physicians and nurses were prohibited from working at most public health facilities due to segregation, and black patients had limited access to modernized health care. The Alachua General Hospital opened in 1928, serving only white patients, and it wasn't until the late 1930s that the hospital dedicated a wing to the care of black patients in Alachua County. This wing consisted of 2 separate wards, one ward with 9 beds for men and the other with 9 beds for women. Prior to the establishment of this wing, black residents had few options. While Dr. Ayer served his community, residents often sought medical care at Brewster Hospital in Jacksonville, Florida, which was a private hospital. The Duval County Hospital also accepted black patients, and Alachua County residents are known to have traveled to FAMU's black hospitals as well to receive care. Due to racist policies of the hospitals in Alachua County, black physicians did not frequent the area until after World War II. In the absence of physicians and medical centers that would treat them, black residents of Alachua County often went without care or relied upon 19th century healthcare practices to get by. Black women often carried the burden of the health of their families and extended family members by serving as nurses and midwives in the absence of professionalized healthcare. In 1949, at age 25, Dr. Cullen Banks assumed responsibility of a private practice from Dr. Orion Ayer, who was relocating due to the racism mentioned above. And a year later, Dr. Edgar Cosby joined him, providing dental care to Black residents in Alachua County. Sources mention that at the time Dr. Banks bought his practice, there were 3 Black physicians in Gainesville. One, Dr. Orion Ayer, who I mentioned earlier, and he was moving from Gainesville to St. Petersburg because he had been denied hospital privileges at Alachua General Hospital. Dr. Banks was the first African-American physician to receive hospital privileges at Alachua General Hospital, and together with Dr. Banks, served the greater Gainesville community for 50 years. So I just wanted to end my presentation with a few notes on the current health statistics in Alachua County and a brief personal anecdote. When I moved to Gainesville, and it was actually difficult for me to find physicians for my entire family, despite the fact that there are more physicians in Alachua County than there are in the entire state of Florida. So more physicians provide care for Alachua County than provide care for other counties in Florida. So it's interesting, and I was trying to get at why this was the case. Why is it so difficult for me to find care for my family, physicians for my family, and especially physicians who I felt were culturally competent? It took a year for my kids to get basic appointments, and the physician I found for myself moved to Jacksonville after I arrived. Practices in Gainesville don't actually make it particularly easy to make appointments, and many of them are only open during school hours, meaning that my kids have to miss school for several hours. And this is something that I heard repeated in speaking to Gainesville residents, indicating that there is a disconnect between the medical care that is provided and the importance of education for our young residents here. The issues that are reflected in the Alachua County Community Health Assessment from April 2024 represent some of the issues that I have experienced myself and that others in Gainesville have experienced. The health assessment states that there's a higher than average number of physicians in Alachua County, which points to other issues in accessing medical care. When we think about these things through multiple domains of power, they are issues that move beyond resources to something that looks more like interpersonal or cultural. As mentioned in the assessment, this can look like providers not respecting the cultural desires of their patients, causing the patient to distrust the relationship with their provider. Historically, African Americans repeatedly mentioned issues of respect and outright racism and discrimination when accessing medical care, causing them to attempt to locate care outside of their locale or often go without. It would also be a mistake to dismiss well-known experimentation on minoritized groups, including the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. The harm from this study exists outside of the men, women, and families they experimented on. The medical community has not done the work to gain the trust of Black Americans following this ultimate betrayal of trust. I teach classes on the history of African American health and medicine, and my pre-med students repeatedly tell me that they are surprised by the history they learned in my classes, and that they haven't learned of any of these atrocities in their pre-med required education. My class is a class that students have to seek out rather than being content that is required, and I think that this is one area that the medical community can begin to address. I just want to end my presentation noting that there are several groups in Alachua County that are doing great work to address medical and health inequities, including the mobile outreach clinic, the equal access clinic, the Helping Hands Clinic, and many others. But there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, and so I'm happy to have a conversation about that during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Speaking about African American cemeteries in Alachua County, cemeteries I consider as outdoor museums. My friends with the Florida Public Archaeology Network talk about that too, because we're in so many cemeteries. They provide a connection to the past and a sense of place. They're vital sources of historical family information. If I'm researching someone, I'll go out to where they're buried and look at who's buried around them. Sometimes, it's kind of rare, but you can find a cause of death sometimes because it's on the marker. I've discovered children that never appeared on a census. They didn't live long enough. So, and then sometimes the type of headstone will give you information about the financial circumstances of the deceased. They could be granite headstones, they could be, I've seen concrete headstones where the names were written in, like with a stick or something. And I see a lot of empty funeral home markers, and I'll explain that a little more. Also, the location of these cemeteries has a significance. When someone comes to the Haile Homestead and is researching their ancestors, an African American comes and asks me that, and they say, my ancestor was enslaved at Haile Plantation. Well, they likely don't know that there were 5 Haile plantations in Alachua County. But I will ask them, where are your ancestors buried? Because if they tell me it's the Patterson Community Cemetery, I'm going to think Thomas Haile or Edward Haile. If they tell me Mount Nebo or St. Matthew's cemeteries, I'm going to think it's the other Haile family members because those are up in a different area, more toward Alachua. The problem is that some African American cemeteries, especially in the South, have been abandoned over the years. There's no family, church, organization left to take care of them. Some are no longer identifiable as cemeteries. I kind of look for rectangular depressions facing east. Sometimes there's just rocks, ornamental plants, or pieces of something that belonged to the deceased. And the empty funeral home markers, and you'll see a picture of one in a minute. But this was normally like a placeholder until a regular stone came in, but it's a metal marker, and it had a piece of glass, and there would be paper about the size of an index card with the deceased information on it. And after several rains, that information is gone, the glass falls off, and this empty marker is left. And I do manage a historic cemetery, the Knapphaus Cemetery. And people have told me over the years, those metal markers get in the way of mowing, and they just pick them up and throw them over the fence. And probably the last anything that tells anyone that someone was buried there. There have been cemeteries deliberately erased. The most famous of these, more infamous, I should say, was discovered in about 2018 in Hillsborough County. It was discovered that the city of Tampa built a housing project over an 800 burial cemetery. They made a show of moving some markers or doing some disinterments, but in fact, the markers were pulled up and this housing development was built there. It's called Zion Cemetery. After that, more were discovered in Hillsborough County and Panelists County. And things like this do happen in Alachua County, sometimes quietly erased by developers, pick up headstones. Nobody knows it's there anymore. Then there are some, quite a few that are at risk today simply because there's no caretaker left or identified to care for the cemetery in the future, or when I'm researching a cemetery, I will go to the WPA church histories, for instance, and some of those are misidentified as white churches, which is not helpful. But those churches dissolve. They go away, they fall down, whatever, and all that's left is a cemetery. And so many are obliterated in favor of development. Did it happen here? Yes. How do you find cemeteries? The one researcher in Tampa was doing research and looking at death certificates, and it kept saying Zion Cemetery. He goes, I don't know where this is. So it started to be looked into, and then the Tampa newspaper got involved and did a big series of investigatory articles. Old deed records, I transcribed some Alachua County deed records. Usually you'll see a graveyard as an exception to the deed. Property Appraiser's website has some cemeteries on it. Register of Deceased Veterans is a good source. Descendants, especially the elders of the family, it's very important to talk to those elders. They can many times tell you who's in an unmarked grave. So it's important to get those things written down. Old maps, developers come across them, and then just word of mouth. My experience with cemeteries, specifically African American cemeteries, goes back to the Virtual Cemetery Project, which Jim Powell Jr., who at the time was the Ancient Records Coordinator at the Clerk of the Court's office, on his own time with his own resources, started this project, and he would go out to these cemeteries and photograph them and put them online. And so many of them are out there, wizardofar.org. Long before Find a Grave, and in fact this is even better because we tried to photograph these markers in some sort of order so you can see who's beside the deceased. But that got me, I joined in 2010, and it got me going with the group into the woods, all kinds of places all over the county, taking pictures. And I'll just mention the Florida Master Site File. It is State of Florida's official inventory of historical cultural resources. There's a category for historical cemeteries. The Florida Master Site File provides the lowest level of protection and identification for a cemetery. So if it's on the Florida Master Site File, a developer, for instance, would have no excuse for not knowing that there was a cemetery there because it will give the location. In June of this year, Sarah Miller, she's the one of the regional directors of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, I'll call it FPAN for short, she estimated that there were around 8,000 African American cemeteries in Florida, and only about 2,000 of them have been identified on the Florida Master Site File. In Alachua County, the latest number I got from FPAN was there are 93 cemeteries on the Florida Master Site File right now. 46 of them are African American only cemeteries. 25 of them were added due to a project with the Alachua County Historical Commission. That would have been me as the rep for that, and Nigel Rudolph, a public archaeologist with the central region of FPAN. So we decided to actively go out into these cemeteries, and I knew many of them from the virtual cemetery team, and we put them on the Florida Master Site File. Many of these cemeteries, well, they were segregated, and many were obliterated in favor of development. There was one that the virtual cemetery team did. Nigel went out to find it, to put it on the master site file. He could find nothing, absolutely nothing left. I'm just going to give you 3 examples of some of these. These are sort of tricky ones. The Pleasant Grove Cemetery in Hague. It is behind a convenience store. There's a storage facility on one side, a road on the other, and in the back is a mobile home park. And I put it on the Florida Master Site File. There it is. You can't tell it's a cemetery. And there's some pictures. I think that's a cat. You see how close the storage facility got to what they said is the boundary. This was in 2008. Couple markers. There's a few more. There's a veteran and then a minister who died, I believe, in 1937. So the Florida statute 497.284 allows a municipality or a county to go into an abandoned cemetery and fix it up, and then turn around and they can try to recover the value of that work from the property owner. So in this case, I think it was Robert Hutchinson was on the county commission. Anyways, he spearheaded the sending of a letter, certified letter to the property owner. And the man refused to take delivery, refused to accept the letter. So at the time, there wasn't any will from the commission to move forward, but that can change. There's at least 2 veterans there, buried there, probably more. The people in the mobile home park believe that their mobile homes are on top of graves. So this is one that's not really been resolved. The property owner chases people away, will not authorize any Boy Scout troop or anybody else who's offered to clean it up to go in there and do it. So this is one of these that it needs resolution. Another one is it's between Newberry and High Springs, and it's beside another abandoned cemetery. So right along the main road between those 2 cities is, used to be a Mount Moriah church. And it's right now, it fell in on itself, so it's all overgrown, but it's a little hill. And next to it was a cemetery. I was out there a month or 2 ago. You can't tell it's a cemetery. But because of some publicity that the virtual cemetery team got, somebody called up Mr. Powell and said, "Oh, did you know there's another one back there? I hunt back there." So we got permission from the property owner. That's important. And we went out there. This is what it looks like. You can see the impression of a road, beautiful old trees. The property owner had no clue there was a cemetery on the property. So we went out there. There's an empty funeral home marker. And then that is a headstone. I mean, it's that overgrown. So it's very difficult to find much there. That one, the property owner is paying taxes on that parcel. So that needs more investigation. Now, don't do this, okay? I really weighed whether or not to show you this marker, because we did this, photographed that cemetery back in 2012. And the next year, FPAN started these cemetery resource protection training workshops around, and we went to one. The first one was in this area, was in Micanopy. And we went to it, and what did we learn right off the bat? Never put chalk, flour, shaving cream on a marker. You can damage it. And by the way, never use a pressure washer or bleach, just saying. This one we almost missed because one little edge was sticking up through the debris, just a straight edge. And we got in there and we started digging and discovered Jenny Thomas, who died in 1887, lived to be 110 years. So she was born around 1777. So a lot of history is buried. I've not been able to find her on a census. But imagine what her life was like. She lived to see her freedom, though. And the last one is the Wade Cemetery. This one is still unresolved. The property owner will not allow anyone on the property, so this is my picture. This is pretty much, I could go up to the fence, and then that's it, it's their property. They have no trespassing signs all over. They would not allow the virtual cemetery team to come on site to take pictures of it. They asked the Historical Commission to write a letter asking, we asked them to let the virtual cemetery team come there. They refused that. So my best friend and I, we went to the property behind it, right there. This is the subject property, and you see it was assigned its own parcel number by the property appraiser. And so we went to this lot here and asked permission to look over the fence. And we couldn't see any evidence of a cemetery. So we've used Google Earth. The lot next door came up for sale at one point. So we pretended we were buyers, and we walked along looking over to see if we could see anything. We interviewed people. This is their deed. There's an exclusion. As I mentioned, often these cemeteries are exclusions to the deeds, and they hold the seller harmless, anything related to the cemeteries. And the thing is, what we learned was this parcel was purchased by Benjamin and Nancy Wade from the Hague family in 1885. And somehow it left the family, but somehow the property appraiser set it aside, identified it, and gave it its own parcel number. So it is not their property, but it's 2 acres in the middle of their property. We learned from speaking to various informants that the black families around there were threatened when the developer was starting to develop this place. We interviewed one woman who had a family member buried there, and she said there were headstones and there was a wall. So you'd think we would have been able to see some of that, and we could not. We did find another descendant. We did a genealogy. We found a local descendant living very close to the cemetery outside of this subdivision, and she agreed to meet with us at a certain time, a certain date. So we came back there, and when we showed up, the windows were open, the TV was on, and she wouldn't come to the door. So we don't know if she was threatened, but as it turns out, there were 2 cemeteries on that parcel. As we learned and did more research, there was a white cemetery called the Campbell Dell Cemetery. And we've actually found a picture of a big marker that should have been there. You'd think we would have been able to see that in all the different ways we tried to get on the property. So what could happen now? You could find a descendant, and state law does say that a property owner has to give descendants access to the property to take care of the cemetery at a reasonable time. And that's why we tried to interview that woman so she could get us onto the property just to see if it was still there. But right now our thought is that it's basically been obliterated. That may not be true, but we will not know that unless we get on site. I imagine the property appraiser could get on site and take a look. But anyways, that one's unresolved. So going forward, as a result of the articles about the Zion Cemetery and the discovery of these other cemeteries that were built over, erased, what have you, the state legislature enacted the Historic Cemeteries Program in 2023. And if you want to look it up, it's Florida Statute 267.21. The good thing about this, there's money attached to it for grants. And I know of 2 cemeteries that have been funded through this grant program. But they have to be, it's for documenting, it's for maintaining. The majority of interments occurring more than 50 years ago with no recorded interment of human remains, cremated remains in the previous 10 years and no contracted future interment or other burial rights. And you shall have a documented association with interments of persons of primarily African American ancestry. So here's some money from the state that is available for anyone. It's for nonprofits, research institutions, however, that can apply for this money, these grants. And there's more information on the Division of Historical Resources site, and also Florida Public Archaeology Network, whatever region that you look at, they all have ways they can assist you in putting a grant like that together. Thank you.
Go ahead.
All right, yes, please.
To Dr. Lester, and it's nice to see a face to go with this voice so familiar from NPR. I've heard the term redemption to refer to the backlash against black progress under Reconstruction. Is that the same thing you called radical Reconstruction? And also to Dr. Cole, my teacher, Manye Filer, told me how when AGH finally brought in black patients, they were on screened porches. And to Ms. Kirkman, if you'll get some ground penetrating radar, I'll let you use my helicopter to lower down to the Wade Cemetery. And if you go up to, if you're ever in Washington, D.C., go down to the south edge of Old Town in Alexandria, fantastic monument created where they recovered a black cemetery that had been covered over by a service station and an office building.
Okay, thanks. Come ahead. We're going to take all 4 questions, and then to the panel, and it will be up to the panelists to remember each of them. So,
this question is for Dr. Lester, briefly. Can you comment on the role of the USDA in the loss of black land? Because I believe that loans were denied over a period of time and contributed significantly to the loss of black farmland. And that's the only question I have. Thank you.
I had a question for each one of you, but I kind of lost track of it. But I wanted to, if I take a stab at it. When we talked earlier about the Spanish period and the British period and all of that in Florida history, it seemed to me that coming from St. Augustine, there's a period of time where blacks and whites were all buried together in the cemeteries, because they have a Catholic cemetery. They were buried based on your religion. And then there's also a period of time where the cemeteries were segregated. So that's just wanted to ask you a question about that as far as the cemeteries. And I wanted to find out if you ever had any information about Dr. Fleming out of Fleming Island. I think she was the first female doctor from that area. And the Ross family has a big farm in Archer. I don't know if you're familiar with them, that family. And one other question is, how do we save our HBCUs? You know, we definitely have a lot of focus on them here lately, especially with the Biden and the Trump administration coming up, that they're focusing on HBCUs, but how do we preserve those HBCUs and their role in educating the black community? And of course, they're educating total community now, black, whites. Of course, I'm a Florida A&M graduate, and there's some folks in Florida A&M that come from Bulgaria, Russia, all over the world, so to speak. So anyway, that's just a question about saving our HBCUs.
Good afternoon. My question is for Dr. Cole, and you talked about health here in Alachua County. What impact has the Affordable Care Act has had on health care here in Alachua County? And also, there's a high rate of black females losing their lives through childbirth. And can you explain why that is so high as compared to other races? Thank you.
Okay. Can we hold and then you can come? We have four sets of questions, and then I'll get to you after we've had a chance to. Thank you very much.
I'll scoot over. I'm the fourth person. Or use my teacher voice. I thank you for putting the face with the voice. I've been doing Florida Frontiers long enough now that people will say, "Do I know you?" And I'll say, "Probably not, but you probably know my voice." So thank you for that. In terms of redemption, redemption is not radical Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction came from the federal government in Congress when they divided the South into districts and placed troops there. Under radical Reconstruction, you get things like the 14th and the 15th Amendment, okay? And the Civil Rights Act that was later overturned. But redemption was when the Democrats came back in control in the southern states, and they said they had redeemed the state from radical Reconstruction. So those are two different historical things. In terms of the USDA, the problems with the USDA and loss of land, that resulted in a very famous case in the 1990s, Pickford versus Glickman. And that case was settled, but not really settled. So lots of farmers who were supposed to get funding didn't get that funding, and it's kind of dragged on and on. That's one of the things I didn't get to talk about, the post-civil rights era. And black farm organizations have been very specific about defending those kinds of problems with the USDA, but they've also brought lawsuits against Monsanto about their seeds, and they've brought lawsuits against farm equipment manufacturers too for various reasons. So their focus has been on sustainability, on the legacy of black farm owners. And by the way, the latest numbers say there are only about 2,000 black farm owners in the whole United States, okay? And so they have been very, very prominent in their lawsuits that they brought, but also in sustainability of the land and in honoring that legacy of black land ownership.
I'll speak to the cemetery issues. I think that grant would cover ground penetrating radar, which is very expensive, unfortunately. I have seen some articles about people using cadaver dogs with some success these days, but I don't know. I've worked with archaeologists who had the GPR, and like for every hour they're on site, they will spend an hour in analysis. And in terms of, I can't speak to what the gentleman said about bearing by faith, but definitely there were segregated cemeteries here. One I can think of in near Rochelle, the Oak Ridge Cemetery. There is a road that divides the cemetery, and you have black people on one side and white people on the other side. And there's a distinct road that goes down through the middle, so you can see the segregation going on.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to remember all of the questions. To the first gentleman, there was definitely sources that I saw that said that black patients, if they were in excess of the number of beds that were available at Alachua General Hospital, that they would be removed to the hallways. And so porches, hallways, things like that. So that absolutely was something that happened. The second question, the second gentleman, you asked me a question about a doctor from Fleming Island. I have just started conducting research about Brewster Hospital and the black nurses. So I have not yet heard of the woman physician that you mentioned, but that's absolutely something that I'm going to get to. I'm going to conduct research on moving forward. And then the third question was about the Affordable Care Act and then the high infant and maternal mortality rates in Alachua County. So I haven't conducted more recent historical research on the Affordable Care Act yet. That is something that I'm going to be getting into as I finalize this, the article that I've been working on for this presentation. But the high infant and maternal mortality rate in Alachua County was perplexing to me because that was something that I learned almost immediately upon moving to Gainesville. And in speaking with physicians around Gainesville, they said that they were doing everything that they can to prevent this or to address these issues. And I think a lot of the issue, it doesn't have to do with the structural because we see the evidence that we have enough physicians. We have enough OBGYNs to be treating people in Alachua County. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the cultural aspect and cultural competency of the physicians who are caring for particularly minoritized populations in Gainesville, but also access. And so not only are we speaking about Gainesville, but we're speaking about the communities in Alachua County who might not have access to the billion-dollar medical industry that is located specifically in Gainesville. I think the mobile access clinics are doing the work to try to address those issues, but it's the work, they can only do so much. And so I think it comes down to how do we get these people from the outer areas who aren't just living in Gainesville, but who are living in the greater Alachua County, how do we get access to them, and how do we think about their schedules? They might be single parents trying to gain access who have several different, they have children, or they can't make it to an appointment, or their work schedule means that they're working shift work and they can't get into the to see the doctor. I think all of those are issues. These are issues that I mentioned in my own speech in having to take my kids out of school in order to get them care. And so I think when these medical offices are closing at 3:30 in the afternoon, that prevents a lot of people who are working until 5 or 6 p.m. from actually being able to access medical care. And so I think there's a variety of different issues at play here. I think the cultural aspect has something to do with it, but I also think reaching the people outside of Gainesville, but still within Alachua County, I just think that they don't have the ability, the transportation, and then the hours may not work with their work schedules. I think that's partially what's at play there.
I'd like to address the HBCU issue. I attended an HBCU, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. I have an oldest son who graduated from Lincoln. My youngest brother and sister graduated at Lincoln. And so one of the ways that we solve the problem is to stop telling our kids that they can't get a good education at HBCU. The assumption is if you go to PWI, you'll get a better education. That's not true. As a matter of fact, the experience, especially the social experience at an HBCU is different. The professors see your children as an inheritance, as family, as opposed to a threat. The second thing is that the alum of the HBCUs, we need to give money back to the school we graduated from. Right? We have to support and help to endow those chairs so that there's enough funding so that these students, the professors can take care of our kids. So that's how I would address that issue.
I'd like to ask one question about the HBCUs and the faculty. And when the predominantly white universities started to try and hire black faculty, often it was black American faculty from the HBCUs, and then quite often Africans who had PhDs seemed to come in and fill some of these positions. Is that an accurate observation? And has that changed as we move forward from that earlier period of integration of higher education?
There seems to be this assumption that Africans are better than African Americans, and that even if we engage with people, and I've had some of these experiences, who are continental Africans, they don't see us as being the same oftentimes. I don't know why that is. I can't explain it, but I think that there's a sense in which there's a division. But the truth of the matter is, until we begin to speak, we all look alike. And so, and so I just think that there's a sense that the Americanization of how we racialize and build relationships is more of a problem than that.
Now, do we have time for a couple more questions, Jake? Okay, one person I turned away, a couple people, so come at two.
It was I that you turned away.
Do you have a question too, Barbara?
Oh,
No,
you sure? Oh, okay.
she'll get in line behind everybody else.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Burgess, and I'm from Alachua, Florida. Say it however you like. To you, Mr. Education, sir. Yes. Ogden, Half Moon, Liberty Hill Negro School, Alachua County Training School, Archer Negro High School, Hawthorne Shell Elementary High School, Rochelle Elementary School, Waldo Negro School, Douglas High School, Elmy Bain High School. I've been fighting this for a long time. Alachua County is made up, can anybody on the panel tell me how many cities are in Alachua County? They call us outliers. We're not, because if it wasn't for our tax dollars, you know. But anyway, I don't want to go negative, but I just wanted, when this forum is supposed to be about Alachua County, everybody except for my cemetery lady talked about Gainesville and Gainesville only. And I just don't think it's fair. It is kind of true. Okay. Well, yeah, they were talking about other states and stuff like that, but I'm talking about Alachua. Okay. I just want to say, before the mid-1800s, see, this is why I don't like to express myself, because it starts something. Before the mid-1800s, I also wanted to bring up Bland, Traxler, Santa Fe, the Bellamy Trail, all of those back in the 1500s, it was kind of close, Damascus Cemetery. There's one, I think somebody else mentioned the archery, and then there's one in Cross Creek that only has about maybe 10 people in it. There's probably hidden away too. And I just wanted to bring up, in the beautiful city of Alachua, there were 5 cotton gins. And I just thought that was interesting because I didn't really know that they grew cotton in Florida. So before the mid-1800s, Spanish Florida and Mexico were the favorite destinations for escaped persons. So I wanted to ask, do you have any knowledge of the Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad in Florida? I know that's not your specialty, but I listen to you every morning, on Saturday morning too. But for the most part, for you historians, I thank you for what you do. And I started the Alachua Historical Society myself. So we went to all those graves that you were talking about. And that is the end of my quotes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I do have a question for Karen. So the person said there's 8,000 undiscovered African-American cemeteries. We only know about 2,000, and they were very difficult to find. I mean, definitely buildings built on them are overgrown. So how did she come to the conclusion there's 8,000? Yeah, that's, I'm looking for an answer. How did she decided there was 8,000 potential?
She will answer that in just do you have a follow-up question to that?
No, that's my question.
Okay. And Barbara?
Okay.
And then they'll answer all the questions.
Mine
Right.
hopefully is a sort of cut and dried. I hope someone didn't ask this while I was out. For Alyssa, when you say that there are more physicians in Alachua County than in the rest of the state, are you counting people who are at UF who are studying to be physicians or not practicing? Do you mean practicing physicians? And why is that? Are they attracted by the university or what?
Okay, so I didn't ask Sarah where she got 8,000. I'm assuming that she looked at perhaps a number of plantations that were in Florida, especially around the Panhandle. It was just packed, and very often they had their own cemeteries. So that's just a guess, but I can ask her sometime.
And to Dr. Gordon, yes. So I'm referring to to be clear, the data that was compiled by the community health assessment is referring to practicing physicians. And so often the students who are taking their residency at UF are not counted as a practicing physician, because often they leave. They're not staying in Gainesville.
Well, I think we owe this panel a round of applause. Thank you very much. And I'll turn this over to Dr. Gordon, who's in charge of everything today.
Thank you very much. We are going to take a short break, but I have a couple of announcements. We're going to have the next panel. We've heard about our past. We had a little bit about our present. We're going to talk about our future. That's the next panel. And I want to engage you as a community to participate in that process. What do you see as our future? After the panel, well, we get you engaged and come tell us so we can put it on tape. The sister who talked about Gainesville, I'm glad that you are doing something in Archer. We want to encourage local history. That's what we're here for. And we'd like to work with you, with other communities in Alachua County. So I want to thank you for actually coming, and I appreciate it very much so. So we'll take a very short break. Please don't go away. Don't go away at all. We're going to look at our future. There will be 200th anniversary cake, and there will be some food, multicultural food coming on. So if you go away, you're going to miss all of that. So take a short break and take a look at these posters and enjoy yourself. Thank you.